Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
As a Vietnam veteran, I too have felt the sting of rejection. I too have felt a slap across the face of a nation who disrespected my service.
Wyoming's most decorated Vietnam War vet and his ongoing fight to win respect and a belated welcome home for his fellow veterans. Next on Wyoming Chronicle. Hello, I'm Richard Ager. Welcome to Wyoming Chronicle. When Lieutenant Lee Alley returned to Wyoming from Vietnam in 1968, the state's newspapers hailed him as a conquering hero, Wyoming's most highly decorated veteran. But it didn't take long for Alley's family and his friends to realize that this war story was not headed for a happy ending. For Lee Alley and many other Vietnam veterans who did make it home, another longer battle was just beginning.
First to fight for the right and to build the nation's might, and the army goes rolling along.
When Lee Alley went to Vietnam, there were a lot of things he didn't know. He didn't know he would be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. He didn't know he would prove courageous in action and be highly decorated. And he didn't know that such honors would prove meaningless. But Lee Alley knew one thing that mattered: the well-being of his troops and fellow veterans. In the end, that is what would save him.
I did not interrupt my college career to go. The academic affairs asked me to leave.
Alley can joke about being drafted now, but it has taken a long journey to achieve that sense of peace. Lieutenant Lee Alley was on the front lines from the day he arrived in South Vietnam, though it was often difficult to tell where the lines began or ended. The uncertainty of life and sudden death had its effect and left Alley and many vets with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as described by the Charlie Daniels Band.
My younger brother calls me a killer and my daddy calls me a vet. Everybody says I'm someone else, that I'm sick and there's no cure. Damned if I know who I am. There was only one place I was sure: when I was still in Saigon. Still in Saigon. Oh, say, can you see?
Some vets have lost that fight. Others continue to rebuild their lives. Wyoming is trying to help, declaring every March 30th Welcome Home Day, which begins with just listening.
Basically, my whole right side didn't work. I still have a little trouble talking because of that, but it just, what happened. I came home to Walter Reed. I didn't come off the plane like most guys did, and I think that's where most guys had their worst experiences, right in the airports when they deplaned, and people in the airports would be mean to them because they're in uniform.
I was spit on. I was called a baby killer. I was refused service in restaurants.
As a Vietnam veteran, I too have felt the sting of rejection. I too have felt a slap across the face of a nation who disrespected my service. How in God's name can you tell a soldier whose arms have held a bleeding and dying comrade, yours was not a noble war? In fact, it wasn't even good enough to call it a war. Let's just call it a conflict.
So around Wyoming, from Wheatland to Warland, from Gillette and Laramie to Cheyenne, a generation of warriors heard the words many had waited for.
Every veteran, every soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, Green Beret must have a proper homecoming. And today is the day that we're doing that. Thank you.
Still, after all these years, can words make a difference?
Thank you for your service, my friend. Thank you.
It makes a lot of difference. People will one day a year kind of sit up and take notice, I guess you'd say.
Is it too little too late?
It's never too late. There's always time, there's always a place for it.
And joining me is Lieutenant Lee Alley, author of Back from War. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You know, you returned from Vietnam in 1968, and you published your book in 2005. What took so long?
Well, it's like a lot of things in life. You have to be ready to do it. And I spent the first portion of my years after coming back from Vietnam basically running and hiding from the war and from all the emotional buildup that I still carried from the war. It was only after getting together with some of my men and finally deciding to talk about this that several of them said, you know, Lieutenant Alley, you have a book in you. And so that's kind of how the book came out. But until that time, I was not ready to talk about it or write about it, either one.
Well, you know, when you begin in the preface to the book, you make it clear that writing about the Vietnam section was difficult, but that you did it for two reasons. One, it's true, and the other was that you wanted to put a face to fellow soldiers. And I'm wondering what you mean by that.
Well, far too often people don't understand the real price of war. And one of the things that I say when I talk to people around the country is if you look at statistics, probably only 2 to 5% of the people really serve our nation. So the other 95 go about their life and get on with whatever. Well, there is a price to war, and a lot of the wounds that come back from war are not physical wounds, they're emotional wounds that people don't see. And so I just wanted to talk about some of these emotional wounds, and I wanted to show that there is a price to war.
Well, you begin on page 1 by writing, and I quote, "I can't see them, but I know they're out there, and they know we are here." Creepy feeling. Sort of a quick introduction to what must have been a very paranoid situation all the time.
Yeah, and in combat, one of the things you become to where you depend on your senses very, very much. And you get to where you can smell the enemy, and you get to where you can feel the enemy. And unfortunately, once that is ingrained in you and everything is instamatic, you have to you act instantly on every little thing. Then a lot of times you spend the rest of your life, smelling and feeling and looking for the enemy.
Well, you know, you mentioned the smells and the senses. You really do take the reader into a very, I would say, visceral experience, right down to the body odors of the enemy, which you describe in uncomplimentary terms, I might add. And then, all of a sudden, we're in the middle of a full-blown attack, and then, as you take the viewer or the reader along, you wake up. It's almost as if you're constantly transposed between past and present. And I'm wondering, does this reflect your experience with what later developed into PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yeah, Richard, I think you're right on, and that's an excellent question, and that's why I wrote that like that, because a lot of times when I'm doing presentations to groups, I'll use that, and then I'll say, well, that battle wasn't 40 years ago. I fight that battle nearly every night of my life. And so that's the point that I'm trying to make, is you always carry that with you. And so people talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's real and it's out there.
I quote you, nighttime is the worst.
The enemy controls the night. That's what I say, is because, you know, when I talk to veterans all over the country, and one of the things that I talk to a lot of veterans that they become workaholics. They'll work 2 jobs, 3 jobs, whatever it is. A lot of them will become alcoholics or a combination of the two, because once you can keep your senses going and flowing and moving, you're okay. But at some point, when you lay down and your head hits the pillow and you go out, that's when your subconscious takes over, and that's the enemy comes out.
The quiet moments.
Yeah.
You know, you're very explicit, I should say to all readers, on a lot of details in here. There was a mission early on in your stay in Vietnam that ended with 2 Viet Cong dead, and you write about just adding them with a marker to the long list of notches on the armored vehicle, and then you stop and say, Jesus, it's possible.
Yeah.
What were you doing at that point? Were you saying, how have I become a person who just casually puts notches on a vehicle for dead?
Unfortunately, war is not pretty. And I can say this because it doesn't bother me anymore, because I've dealt with a lot of my emotional stuff. But I found myself, I could turn to the dark side very easily. War is life and death. And taking life and marking them down on a grease pencil did not bother me one bit. But the other side of that is then you sit back and you think, whoa, what have I become?
Well, you did write, and here's a quote, how can I, Lee Alley, back then a normal, everyday, kind of untested young Wyoming man, so easily have become what you call a hired killer?
Yeah.
What kind of answer did you come up with for that? You're still doing it.
I'm still working through that process, but I guess it's always been amazement to me how you can take a country farm boy that, you know, just lived life in the country, and all of a sudden you have somebody that will go to no ends to do bodily injury to somebody.
You know, there are occasions and passages in the book where it's just almost endless horror, I have to say. The Battle of Fire-Based Cudgel,
yes,
to mention one. A night battle in which you and your men ended up all night long in a drainage canal, avoiding the Viet Cong. And you were beset with endless mosquitoes, leeches, and, quote, those friendly rascals, once attached to your body, quickly bloat to the size of a hot dog. That kind of mental imagery clearly is very disturbing. It's right out of a horror film.
But that's the way it is. I mean, you know, I will say one thing. Vietnam is a beautiful country, but it has, I used to tell anything over there will either bite you, scratch you, or kill you. Because they've got a lot of snakes and a lot of leeches and a lot of nasty stuff over there.
For such a small country, right?
Yeah.
There's an episode when you had a little spare time and I'll just say, it's sort of I would characterize it as a drunken misadventures in a house of ill repute.
Well said.
It is in the book. Readers can get the details.
Yeah.
But what I'll ask you is, why did you add that to the book? Were you trying to really just emphasize the absolute honesty that you approached your adventures?
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to put that in the book is, if you stop and think about it, I was 21 years old. And when you get 21-year-olds with alcohol, whether you're in Vietnam or Wyoming, you do stupid things. And part of that is that I wanted people to know, okay, I've been out and I've done that, but if you really stop and analyze it and look at it, I'm still a 21-year-old kid doing stupid things, spreading your wings. And so that was
sowing your wild oats.
Sowing your wild oats. And so that was really part of the story, was just to show people how what stupid people do.
Or how normal, in fact.
Well, that's yeah, the war, even in war, the 21-year-old comes out in you.
There was a point at which there was a battle, and you seemed troubled by what happened after the battle, which was a mass burial of the Viet Cong. And I'll quote you saying, I remember the sight of all those dead bodies, and I see them not as enemies, but perhaps as husbands, fathers, sons, brothers, cousins, and neighbors to someone. Did that signify you in a transition, no longer perhaps hating the enemy? You saw some common humanity? And did that make your task as a soldier easier or more difficult?
I think that and I remember the incident very well, and I guess one of the things that really hit me was, you know, when you're shooting at somebody and you're 30 meters away or 10 meters or whatever, It's, you know, you're shooting and whatever. But when you go up and the bodies are laying there, and I think we had 120 killed that day, or 150, I don't know. They were all lined up there in the rice fields. Excuse me.
Because the body counts always seemed important, didn't they?
Yeah, and
commanders.
there's been books written about the body kill, and we can go into that on a different deal. But the thing that struck me was how young they were. I mean, I was 21 years old, but looking at these bodies, I think that there had to be a lot of 13, 14, 15-year-olds and how young they were. And, you know, you just, all of a sudden, they weren't the enemy anymore. They were just somebody's kid that was, you're not going to get a proper burial. You're going to end up in an unmarked grave in Vietnam. And
so when you had those thoughts, did that have a lasting effect on you?
About 30 seconds. Because then all of a sudden reality has to come back. And one of the things that I really focused with myself and my men, if you don't stay focused over there, you will die.
You mentioned that because, of course, soon afterwards, a really truly awful episode that you read about in the book, you sent your friend, Lieutenant Dick Barr, on a patrol. His vehicle was blown up. And when you arrived on the scene, your soldiers had actually brought you the suspect who most likely had actually set off the bomb.
Yes.
And you lost it.
Yes, I did.
What happened? What were you going to do?
Well, I was going to kill him.
How far did you get?
I took my knife and I started to cut off his ears first. I was going to make him die a slow, painful death.
So you were on the verge of committing a war crime.
Oh, absolutely.
And your Vietnamese interpreter stopped you.
Yes, he did.
How?
He just grabbed me by the arm and he said, Lieutenant Ali, he said, this will never leave you. And he said, you are too good a man to do this. And he said, please do not do this.
And what went through your mind at that point?
I just dropped the knife and I thought, my God, what have I become? But the other side of that is, I just remember the commander on the radio kept calling in and said, Lieutenant Ali, how many people did you lose and how many people did you lose? And I said, I don't know, because all I can do is gather up all the arms and the legs and divide by two, because I have no idea. There's no...
That's all that was left, wasn't it?
That was all that was left. And I would have killed him.
It was not all that long after that your tour actually ended.
Correct.
In Vietnam. Bit of a rough exit from Saigon. And back home, you write that the newspapers had hailed you as a returning hero, quote, recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor. And Lieutenant Ali is one of the most decorated soldiers ever to come out of the state of Wyoming. A long list of honors that you were clearly due. And yet, the sense I get from what you write is that it all just didn't seem to mean a whole lot to you.
It meant nothing to me. I mean, I just, in fact, I didn't want anybody to see the medals. I didn't want anybody to know that I had the medals. The medals were not why I went over there. And in many ways, and this may sound strange, but in many ways I really felt that I failed in a lot of ways.
At one point, your parents gathered all your medals together and put them into a beautiful display case.
Yes, they did.
You did not react well.
I did not. I came back, I was going to the University of Wyoming, and I went to school one morning, and I came back, and they had gotten into my belongings and found all my medals and had them put into a beautiful display case and had it on the wall, and I just went crazy because I did not see them as glorious. I saw them a lot as I failed in a lot of ways. We left a lot of guys over there.
You know, you write about that period of coming home that our government is very generous in sending our soldiers to fight for freedom, but, and I'll quote you, as a nation we fail miserably when it comes to the care of our veterans.
Yep.
How did that first manifest itself to you, that you were in trouble and there wasn't the kind of help that you needed?
Well, first of all, I mean, you know, my vice was alcohol. I drank a lot. And when I was in Laramie, Wyoming, going to the University of Wyoming, I didn't go to the bar to have fun and be one of the guys. I went to get drunk and be by myself, and it just got to the point that I thought, Lee Alley, you're spiraling down. We've got to do something about this. And very fortunately, I married a wonderful girl that I met at the University of Wyoming, Ellen, and I credit her with saving me, because we didn't talk about the war. She didn't even know anything about me being a veteran, but she understood that I had some issues and was willing to deal with them.
So much of the road to recovery was finally reuniting with some fellow veterans, was it not?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, there's a thing that the veterans go through that if you weren't there, if you didn't taste it, if you didn't smell it, and if you didn't touch it, you don't understand. And if you don't understand, I'm not talking to you. I'm zipping it up. I'm locking it away. Well, there are people out there that do understand, but we don't get it. You know, we just lock it away. And I was to the point that I had to find somebody to talk to. And then just one day, it's like, well, who am I going to talk to? Well, it has to be the ones that I served with. And my quest to find these guys began.
You described an encounter with Jim Deister.
Yes.
Last time you had seen him, he had been carried off in a medevac chopper, and it most likely wasn't going to live.
Right.
All those years later, he was living a full life, albeit with some physical ailments. Mm-hmm. And you asked how he had come back, and he said to you, "I did it, Lee, because I had to." And you write that those are the words that changed your life. He did it because he had to.
Yeah, I mean, and I just remember looking at Jim, and I was just in shock. I thought, first of all, I didn't know he had even lived, and secondly, he has some very his face and head is disfigured, and he has some terrible hearing problems, and he has a master's degree in counseling and works for vocational rehab in Kansas. And I'm thinking, how could that be? And when he said, "Lee, I had to do something with my life," and I thought, wow, maybe I should do something too.
You know, in a chapter, actually in your book, written by your son, Bo, he wrote about going to a reunion with you, and he realized he was older than you had been when you were in Vietnam. How did you end up talking to him about your experiences? Was that tough?
I would never talk to my son about any of this stuff. I just did not want him to know or be a part of it. And I think one of the first times that the door cracked open a little bit was my son had a real want to get out into the wilderness and hunt. And I did not have that desire, to be very honest with you. When I came home, my weapons and everything went away, and I just wanted to divorce myself from that. Well, his want to do all of this, and my son and me being the father, I took it upon myself to teach him to hunt. And I just remember one day it was on a hunting trip, and he and I were stalking a deer, and finally the shot was there, and I just remember my son kept saying, "Shoot, Dad." He wasn't old enough to have the license himself, but I was just in the teaching process, and he just kept saying, "Shoot." And finally, I just put down the rifle and I said, "I think we need to talk about a few things here. If I pull that trigger, that deer is dead. Do you understand what that means?" And from that, we just sat on that rock for a couple of hours and we just talked about life and death.
You speak to a lot of veterans groups around the country. Here's what you had to say a little earlier this year.
Never again can we allow this nation to let our military people be the whipping boy for political decisions. We go, we serve. When I left Vietnam, we were winning.
Were you saying that the U.S. would have been better off prolonging its stay? Did you? I wasn't clear
Not at all.
On your
Not
stance.
at all. That statement is very simple to explain. The Vietnam soldier went down in history as the first one to lose a war. And I'm going to be very, very frank with you today. The Vietnam veteran was not even welcomed back into the States by other veterans. I'll be very honest with it. We were not welcome into a lot of VFWs. We were not welcome into a lot of Legion halls because they have the greatest generation. And I love these guys. I love these World War II guys, and I love the Korean guys. But we went down in history as the guys that lost the war. And
you let down the side, right?
We let down the nation. And that's why I said, by God, when I left, we were winning.
Well, Lee Alley, thank you for joining us, and thank you for a very honest book that speaks very directly to all of us.
It was an honor to be here, and I was glad to do it for you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for this week, but visit our website at wyomingpbs.org for more of our interview with Lee Alley, including the story of Damn It the Dog, a mutt that earned a special place among Alley and his troops. And do join us again for Wyoming Chronicle.
I would ask the veterans in here and the veterans that I speak to on a daily basis, I ask them to take the silent oath that I have taken. And as I walk the airports of this great nation, and as I walk the malls of this great nation, my eyes are eagerly searching out the young veterans today, either going to or coming home from war. And I want you to grab them, hold them, shake their hands, and say, thank you so much for your service. And as you look in their eye, you will know the price they're going to pay for where they're going. And that price will be with you the rest of your life. Thank you so much, and welcome home.